Hello again, everybody. I'm back again. This will be the third and final video I do for the Kickstarter. Just looking at it here, there's about 6 days to go. By the time this publishes, probably be around 5 days to go. As of March 8th, be all published by the 9th, so it's coming near the end. It is funded in terms of if all the money goes through, bang, the game will go. We're trying to get that last stretch goal. So we'll talk about the stretch goal a little bit later on. What I wanted to do was take some time for those who might be a little curious about how the game plays, or might be on the fence as to how some of these different mechanics play out. I thought what I would do is kind of show you how the game works from my basic understanding of it, and then we'll go back and talk about the Kickstarter and how maybe you can contribute if you haven't yet. Mostly it's because I want to get the next stretch goal, which looks really, really great. So let's talk about the game first. Let's move that over here. So I've got the my second monitor up. I've got the rule book up on the other page, so if I want to come back and show you something, I'll just pull the rule book over. And for now, we'll just take a look at the map. One of the stretch goal ideas, and I thought was great, was to maybe include a couple scenarios that are just a few infantry or maybe just a few armored vehicles to demonstrate the basics of the game. Kind of reminded me of like the advanced squad leader, what are those starter kits, and I haven't played those, but I've seen them and I was like, well, that's a good idea. Start small, work your way up. So what I have here is, instead of a full scenario, this is just kind of like a few infantry and a couple armor to demonstrate some basic concepts of the game. So we'll just play through a turn, and then we'll pull up and discuss different stats on the units as we kind of progress through. If you have the rule book, I'll point out different things in the rule book as I remember to call them out where I found the information. So the way the turn starts, so starting at the beginning, the turn structure, you roll for initiative. Every turn you roll for initiative, and that's 2 dice, and the higher person gets initiative for that turn. So your scenario will dictate how many turns you have. So you have a turn track. Now on the map, because this map I just took it from a screenshot on the Flying Pig website, and the only editing tool I have is the paint that comes with Windows. So it's going to be real hard to see the hex numbers, like this is CC 20. So real hard to see. The quality is real terrible, but this was the best I could get as far as like a map. But it doesn't have all of the tracks. Now if you go to the website, you'll see partial pictures of the tracks, but not the entire thing. So what I have here is I got a turn tracker. The way it works is if your scenario dictates like 10 turns, you just bump your turn tracker up to 10, and then every turn you just reduce by 1. Once you get down to the last turn, then you and your opponent both roll 1 dice 6, and if the total equals 7 or more, you then play the final round 0. So it's possible that you could play 14 turns or 12 or whatever, but there's a chance, slim chance, that you can actually play 1 additional turn, and then at the end of that additional turn 0, then the game would actually be over. Alright, so once you have the turns figured out, you're going to roll for initiative. So it's 2 dice 6, and then the higher side would get initiative for that turn. So German player rolls 8, Russian player rolls 6. So the German player in this example would get the turn initiative. Now once you have initiative, the next thing you do is you determine how many impulses you're going to have. So we're going to determine how many impulses each person has, because as the game plays out, you alternate impulses. So let's show you what that looks like. I guess you could determine impulses first, but I do initiative, then we'll do impulses. So German player, for this scenario, because it's only just a few units, I'm going to do 1 dice 6 impulses. Your scenario card for a full game will actually tell you how many dice each player gets for their impulses. So I'm just doing 1 dice 6 because it's just a couple of units here. So I'm going to say for the German player, he gets 3 impulses. So you would pull up your impulse tracker. I'm going to give myself 3 impulses. And then for the Russian player, we'll just put these kind of side by side. He rolled a 2, so not much going on there. Later on, casualties will dictate the total amount of impulse points you get, minimum of 1. The person that's got the most, like if you have fewer impulses than your opponent, you can actually pass when it's your impulse. You can just say pass. Once your opponent, like let's just say if my German player had 6 impulses, the Russian player had these 2. When I spend an impulse as the German player, then the Russian player could say, well, I pass, because I don't want to act yet. I want to see how the German player continues maneuvering forces. And so the German player would keep using his impulse. Now he has 2 impulse. The Russian player could still pass because they're tied. But the thing is, as soon as you have more impulse points than your opponent, you can't pass anymore. So at some point, the Russian player is going to have to play an impulse. Then what that means is, if you have more impulse than your opponent and you want to pass and not do anything, then you won't activate any units, but then you have to spend an impulse. So really, passing is pretty beneficial when your opponent has a lot more impulse points than you. So in our example here, my German player only has 3 impulse points. He can't pass. He's going to go ahead and activate. So what you do is, you have to decide what you want to do, which unit do you want to act. And the impulse points, if you're curious what that represents, in the book it explains it really, really well what the impulse points do for you. So if you go to section 3 of the Living Rules, if you go to Flying Pig Games website, go to their OST site specifically, they have a copy of the Living Rules. That's what these are. So I'm looking right here in section 3. They represent a lot of things that I like in a game. Like when I play Combat Commander, a lot of that's built into random events, the cards you draw. But it represents poor communication, ammo shortages, fear under fire, courage under fire, getting lost, disregarding orders, and 1,000 other things that do not appear in any textbook. So basically, it's the unknowns of the conflict that allow either some of your people to act or none. Like if you can only activate 2, then the ones that you didn't activate, you could theorize were given orders but chose not to act for whatever reason. So it has a lot of these intangible things baked into the rules. I like that. Then the rules go back and forth. So now the German player is going to spend some impulse points. So let's take a look at that real quick. Now I'm looking here. We'll explain the units here in just a second because we're going to show you through gameplay. So you want to start moving units. So you're going to look at this limiting action. So essentially, the way the game works is I'll spin an impulse and then my opponent will spin an impulse. If I do a group move or a group fire, that costs me 2 impulse points because I activate 2 units. Now what do you do with those units? They can do 2 aggressive things in a turn. Okay, so you can, like, say fire with the unit and then move it, or move and then fire, or you could fire twice and then the unit would be considered used, and then as a final action, even though it's been used, it can do an assault move or intensive fire, which will exhaust it and the unit becomes shaken. So basically you can do quite a bit with a unit as far as combat goes, and if you want to push the unit to its extreme limits, you have the chance of exhausting it and shaking the unit. So we'll explain what shaking and all that stuff does, but that's what you can do. You can do more than one thing with these guys. In fact, when it comes to doing other actions like rallying them, you can attempt more than one rally per turn, but you can only do 1 impulse at a time. So looking here at the field, what I've done is I've set up a couple little spots here to help demonstrate some rules. For instance, the German player has deployed 2 squads. Over here in this squad we have a rifle squad with an attached light machine gun, and it's got a sergeant leader with it. Down in this hex we have 1 rifle squad, nothing else attached to it. And then down here we have a Panzer 6. We have a Tiger tank. So we'll show the Tiger in action here in a minute. For the Russians, I have Oh, I put shock troops. I didn't want a shock troop. Well, I got excited. I just wanted to have rifles. Okay, so almost a similar setup for the Russian defender. It's got 2 rifle squads. Down here, this squad has a light machine gun attached, and it also has a leader attached. And then they're in a building. So if I move that stack, they're in a little building. And then this squad up here is in a tree, well, in the woods hex. And then these guys are deployed behind this hedge for a little bit of protection. Now the Russians have brought 2 tanks. They brought a 1940 version of the T-34 and then a 1941 version of the T-34. The graphics aren't very good because, again, I use paint to make some mods, and I've learned as with paint expand and shrink images, it distorts them. So I'll show you as best I can what we're looking at as we move along. Alright, so since your player has the initiative, I have 3 impulses. What I want to do is decide how do I want to spin my impulse. So because the game kind of goes, you know, like I do something, you do something, what I've not liked about that in some games is it really feels like you can't put together any kind of coordinated attacks. Like if you play the game Bolt Action, the miniatures game, and they do a system where you draw a dice. It's like a chip pull, but you draw a die from a bag, and the color that comes up is who goes next. So it gives you alternating actions. The problem is with something like that, since you never know who's going to go, it's real hard to try and coordinate having 2 or 3 squads try and work together. Like, you know, let's try and do a flanking maneuver. You go this way or that way, or kind of move together with some kind of coherency, which, you know, kind of makes sense to a degree because, again, those uncertainties of war, you never know what's going to happen when you're making maneuvers. But there should be a chance to get some kind of coordinated movements. Well, we have that here. They do allow for group moves and grouped firing. Now, it is limited, though. You have to have a leader attached to a squad, and then you can do no more than 2 squads, and then those squads have to be adjacent or in the same hex. So if I had a whole bunch of units out here, I have seen games like Combat Commander or Conflict of Heroes. As long as there's a continuous chain of adjacent units, you can move a whole bunch of people at once, just which looks great in like a World War II game, you know, because you might advance like a whole column. But when you're talking about smaller skirmish type of events here, like we're doing, like a few squads, it probably makes more sense that you're going to move smaller groups of men at a time than like a whole bunch in like a company coordinated attack. And so this impulse system allows you to move a couple folks to try and coordinate fire or movement, but it doesn't make it, you know, it still makes it so you got to go back and forth between players. So no one's really out of the action for very long. So example, what I'm going to do here is we're going to do a coordinated fire attack against this unit up in the trees. So to do that, we have to activate the units. Now, because it's 2 units acting, that's 2 impulses. So even though they're going to act as 1 unit, I am activating 2. So that takes 2 of my impulses. And to do an attack like this, you're going to add up all their firepower. Now, the attached leader, they don't have their own firepower. They have their own special rules. What they do, though, is they add to the overall attack of an attached group that they're with, whether it's a fire group, so they can help modify it to hit roll, well, the damage roll. So what we're going to do is look here at the rifle. Rifles have a range of 6 and firepower 4. I've got 2 of those, so that would be firepower 8. The light machine gun adds its firepower, so that's 8 plus 2 is 10, plus the 1 from the leader, so that gives me an 11. Now I'm going to compare that with the defense of this rifle squad. They have an inherent defense of 4. Okay, when I pull up the terrain chart, I just got to look here at woods, come across defense of 2, blocks line of sight. So they're in the woods, so we can still fire into it, but they get a +2 defense. We're going to close that. So they're 4 plus 2 is 6. versus my 11 firepower. And the way combat works, let's pull that chart back up. You just compare now the relative strength and the defense. So my firepower of 11, subtract their defense of 6, gives me a +5 firepower. So I actually have a column that's +5 and +6. So what this represents, there's no to hit roll. Basically, your bullets are landing in the hex. We're just going to see how effective all of those bullets are in the hex. So you're going to roll 2 dice 6, a 5 and a 4, 9. That's pretty good. So I go 9, come all the way across to my 5, 6 column. I get an X. And right here on the side, it tells me an X is destroyed. Ooh, so that was a lucky opening strike. So when I right-click the unit, I don't have like a destroyed, but a destroyed, I'm just going to remove them from the map. So goodbye. Now a couple things happen here. First of all, the German player would get victory points. So I'm not really tracking victory points here, but if I were, I would have a German victory point tracker and a Russian victory point tracker, and then you would just, you know, move it up here in the victory points. Now what you could do is in some games your victory points kind of counter swing against each other, and then the person who has the most victory points on their side wins. So you can even do this isn't how it's done, but I just thought, well, I know what I could do is then every time somebody gets victory points, you just swing the marker in their direction. So positive would be German victory points, and then anyway, I just made something up for me. Alright, so we would track victory points. Again, that would be dictated by the scenario. Now the other thing we get is we have to track casualties. So I'm going to track Russian casualties on a Russian casualty tracker. So since I just destroyed infantry, you get 2 points, because you get 1 point for reducing them and another point for reducing them again or destroying them. So it's like a 2 steps. So you get 1 point per step. So I'm going to inflict 2 casualties on the Russian player. Now that's important because once you hit 5 casualties, every time that you roll for more of your impulse points, you then subtract 1 point from your total rolled for each 5. So for example, if I had 6 Russian casualties and I was rolling for impulse, I roll my 1 dice 6, I would roll a 1, subtract 1, but you always get at least 1. So that's hurting. But if I had rolled a 2, then I'd be stuck right down at 1. So casualties can hurt in the long run. So right now we'll put it back to 2. The other thing that happens is these guys now get what's called a first fire marker. The reason why it's a first fire marker is because they can fire twice in a turn. So that's their first fire. I just rearranged these horribly. Oh, too far. There. Alright, so that's that impulse is done. So now it shifts over to the Russian player. Now the Russian player has 2 impulses as well, and he's got some choices to make. So first thing is he's got a leader down here. Now this number in the circle is a 2 for the Russian. The leader for the sergeant has a 1. That's how many X's out they can influence, such as giving a bonus to a rally check, for instance. This guy here can only do 1 hex, so he could give a rally bonus to here, but that's as far as it would go. This lieutenant here, he can rally out to 2, so unfortunately where he was positioned, if it was needed, this Russian unit up in this woods hex would not get the benefit of like a rally roll bonus for the leader. Now the other thing too, the infantry leader cannot influence armor. So I'm sure at some point they will have special armor commanders as well, you know, panzer leader, things like that, and then those will be able to give bonuses to the tanks. So infantry right now only affects infantry. So what we can do then as the Russian player is decide, well, since I don't have group, now when I had an infantry up here, they wouldn't be able to do a group fire because they're too far apart. Even though these two down here are close, because one's armor, one's infantry, they still can't do group movements together. Or can they? 2 units. Vehicles may not group move. An exception to this is assault. Okay, yeah, that's the thing. So they can't group together unless they're doing an assault into a close combat hex. So this is no close combat. We're not going to get that far. So essentially then, as a Russian player, I'm just going to decide, what do I want to do? Well, I know that these tanks, let's talk about armor. So I've got some T-34s ready to shoot at a Tiger and see what we can do to it. So let's take a look. First off, let's take a look at a Tiger tank, and then we can discuss some possible options here. I didn't explain the infantry very well. We just did combat. Let's take a quick look at an infantry counter right here. So here on the infantry counter, it's got several pieces of information. It's got the firepower, which represents their volume of fire with their guns and weaponry, and the little subset number is the range in hexes. This middle number is their basic inherent defense, how well they can hide and protect themselves. I'm sure more elite units have a higher defense because they know better how to hide. 3 is their movement. Higher movement represents, how easier it is for them to move as a group. Pioneers have a 3, rifles have a 4. Well, pioneers also carry mines, flamethrowers, all kinds of stuff. Kind of weighs them down a little bit. Each unit also comes with a data card. Data card replicates all the information of the counter, plus it puts special rules on the card as well, so you don't have to keep flipping through the rule book. But that's your basic infantry counter. So not too much information, very easy to read. Let's take a look at a tank. Alright, so here's a Stug. It's got a lot more information on it. So first, again, we have movement here in the upper right. This is how many hexes it moves, and this oblong shape is a track movement. 2 little circles represent a wheeled vehicle. So this is tracked. It then has 2 armor values. The top number is the front defense, bottom number is the rear defense. So the Stug is pretty well rounded. Up here to the upper left, there is this red triangle. Now the red triangle portion represents the front of the vehicle. That's the direction it's going to travel. So in this game, facing is important. That red triangle has to be on a hex side, and that represents the direction it's traveling. So if it wants to pivot, that costs movement points to turn and pivot and then travel forward, and you have to pay terrain costs to move. So that's what the red is for. The little black square or little black triangle portion that represents the fire arc for the vehicle. So the Stug is an assault gun. It has a fixed forward facing cannon, and so it has to rotate the vehicle in order to shoot into its front firing arc. So it does not have a turret, whereas a tank, let's take a look here at the Tiger. The Tiger tank has the red triangle, but it doesn't have that black triangle because its turret shoots 360 degrees. So it only has the red indicating its front forward arc. Now, if you were to compare the 2 stats, they have both these vehicles on the Kickstarter page, you'll see that the Tiger is a much more powerful machine. So that's the armor values. There's the firing arc. Okay, so now what we have here is the weapon values. So general information on the on the right hand side, weapon data on the left hand side of the counter. This 5 represents the high explosive firepower of the gun, and it shows the range of that weapon for the high explosive shell. It's very similar to like infantry. So if I wanted to fire at infantry or guns, or crew served weapons such as, I think there was one here, like here, the flat guns, the 88s, those are counted as soft targets because they have a reverse side, because you're attacking the crew as well as the actual item itself. But you would use your HE rounds against those. For armored vehicles, you're going to use your AP rounds, armor piercing rounds, and that's represented by the second number, a 16. The triangle represents that the range data is on the data card itself. So let's pull this off and then look at a, I wonder, can I put these next to each other? So for example, this is a KV1. It's the only data card that I could find. I could not find a sample data card for like the Tiger. So what we'll do is we'll look at the KV1 and see how that would compare with like a Tiger. So the KV1, the data information on the card tells me the different range bands we have for the main weapon. So range of 0 to 5 gives me the maximum potential armor piercing power, which is listed on the counter. And that little yellow triangle just simply reminds you that you need to see the data card to get all of the firing data. So if this was a KV1, I would come over here and I would look to count my spaces to the target. And that would indicate to me that the hit roll I need to roll to see if I hit the vehicle, and then the armor piercing factor of the weapon at that range. Because basically the AP rounds are the different type of kinetic energy piercing rounds. Early sabos or armor piercing capped, explosive. All of those shells that rely on their kinetic energy are going to drop off in power the farther out they go. They just lose some of that initial punch. So that's what this chart tells you, is how hard it is to hit at range, which represents optics, crew training, and then the AP value just tells you how hard that round is still able to hit after it travels that distance. So with that information, let's just keep this card up here for a second. So the Russian player is going to look and see if he's got line of sight and range. So I'm going to pull out my, we'll just close that for a minute. Pull up my line of sight thread. So this tank, line of sight thread cuts through some woods right here. So what I'm going to do is take a look at the player A chart. In most games, woods block line of sight, and sure enough, woods here, it says block line of sight column, woods do. So this T-34 would not be able to see the Tiger because it cuts through the woods. Now some of these things say block line of sight, it just says that it is an obstruction. So if it's an obstruction, it doesn't quite block line of sight, but it reduces your firepower by 1 for each obstruction you pass through. So hedges, for example, they are going to drop that firepower a little bit. A stone wall, so nothing that blocks your entire line of sight but partially blocks line of sight would just reduce your firepower a little bit. So essentially this tank can't shoot at the Tiger. So we'll check this guy here, range 7, and he can see it bypasses the wood, so he's got line of sight. So let's pull up our data card again. So I know it's range 7, so I look at my range band. Now these two numbers in these boxes represent a completely different vehicle. I just don't have a KV1 counter to match it up so it looks right. So I'm going to use this T-34 and pretend. So the T-34 then at range 6 needs a 7 to hit. So before I worry about armor piercing rounds, let's just roll to hit. I roll 2 dice 6, I roll a 12. A 12 is a critical hit. I'll show you what that does in a moment. So what I'm going to do is compare my armor piercing value of 7. Now this chart here shows that the armor piercing value dropped by 1 point at that range. So I'm going to do a courtesy and just go from 7 and drop that to a 6. So 6 armor piercing versus the defense of the front armor of the Tiger, because it's coming in through the front arcs. The Tiger has 10 armor. So you're going to take the difference. That's a -4 on the combat chart. The defender has higher armor. So let's take a look at our combat chart. And I'm going to come down to vehicle combat. So I have a -4 column. Now because I rolled a critical hit, I rolled 2 6s. It says here critical hit, roll a 12. You shift a column 1 to the right. So I'm going to go from the -4 column to the -3 column. I roll 2 dice 6 to see what I did. I roll a 10. So I'm going to look at the 10, come over to the -3, and what you see here is a B. And B tells me it's broken. Now, on your scenario card, when you start, everybody is given a gut value, like a gut check value, which is to help determine morale and effects of combat when you take damage. And what you do as a defender who has to now check and see if this unit has been broken morale-wise, I roll 2 dice 6 and I have to beat the gut score. So for this scenario that I just made up in my head, we're going to say everybody has a gut score of 7. Gut score is great because that can really determine how willing you are to stay in the fight. So you could say that very experienced troops might have a gut score of 6, raw recruits might have a gut score of 8. If this ever comes out with like a Pacific campaign, you might say Japanese have a gut score of 5 because they fight to the last man. You know, so it really can kind of dictate how much punishment these guys can take before they want to just sit down and rest and rally before they get back in the battle. So I've got a gut score of 7. So I'm going to roll 2 dice 6, and he rolled a 7. So the tank crew, they were hit by the T-34 shell, and it shook the crew, but they were able to keep their wits about them, and they're staying in the fight. And now this guy here, he gets marked with his first fire, because that's one of his aggressive actions. And then that's his impulse. So that's a full round of combat. Now there is one other thing here that I forgot to mention on the counters for the tanks, is right below the 16 for the AP value, they have a machine gun value. So right here he has a firepower of 2 and a range of 6. So he could, this Tiger at least, could engage a tank and then fire his secondary weapon as well as part of his impulse. So we're going to look here at the Russian. Now the Russian has the same thing. Oh, they're stuck together. So he's got a firepower 2 weapon and a range of 6. So we're going to see, yep, range of 5. So he's actually in range of these infantry. So what he's going to do is, for which I should do before I totally wrap this up with him, is fire his machine gun unit here. And combat's exactly the same as infantry to infantry, because now I'm just using my machine guns. So I have a firepower 2. Let me look at their defense. So they have a defense, basic defense of 4. And now the hedges give, terrain chart, hedge gives 1 defense. So I have a defense of 5. So if I look at my defense of 5, subtract their firepower 2, it's a negative 3 because I have a higher defense. So I'm going to roll 2 dice 6, roll a 7, come across on the minus 3, and it's blank. So he fired his machine guns, but they didn't do anything. So with that in mind, the tank is done. And we would then come back to the German player. Now the German player, I got 1 impulse left. So this is where you have to start, you don't have to start now, but one of the things about the impulse points is either A, I could have the Tiger return fire, or I could, like, if the enemy had moved, I could have maybe done an opportunity fire and used one of my impulse points to opportunity fire at the vehicle that was moving on the other opponent. But since it's my turn and I have to spend an impulse, I can either have the German unit do a group fire again and shoot at this group of infantry, or I can go ahead and have the Tiger tank attack one of these Russian T-34s. So I'm going to go ahead and have the Russian vehicle, I'm going to have the German Tiger fire back. So we're going to actually shoot at this guy here because I don't have line of sight to this guy, so I'm stuck with this one. So this is now exactly the same process, except we're going to go backwards. I have an attack value of 16. Let's pull the unit card. So again, this is KV1, but we're going to kind of copy some of the stats here. I'm going to give myself a to hit roll of 7. So to fire the Tiger, I'm going to spend my last impulse of the turn. I'm going to roll my 2 dice. I roll an 8, which is enough to hit the T-34. So this 88mm shell, bam, slams into the T-34. And because of the range, I'm going to subtract 1 from the armor piercing factor because we're not close range. It's lost a little oomph. But that drops my 16 down to a 15. Now these vehicles are out in the open, but we can also look at the player aid chart. This is something I didn't explain before. They have all these modifiers that you can take into account. If your vehicle was moving, there'd be a penalty. If you had the attached leader, it's a +1. There's firepower modifiers. So I set it up specifically so we didn't have to worry about calculating a bunch of modifiers. But you can look down here and you can see the obstructions. If you're shaking, there's a penalty. So these guys are actually good to go. They're not shaken, they're not reduced, anything like that. They are ready to shoot, scoot and shoot. So I'm going to take that 15 firepower, compare that with my T-34 defense, which is 6 armor to the front. So 15 minus 6 is 9. And if you look here at the column, it's 7, plus 7 or more. So 7 is kind of where the pinnacle of firepower. Beyond that is not needed. It's pretty deadly. So now that I know the column I'm on, I'm going to roll 2 dice. And I roll a 10. So 10, scoop that across, that's an X, destroyed. So my tiger shoots, so I'm going to give him his first fire marker. He spin his impulse, and this Russian tank is destroyed. And we'll just, oh, now infantry, when you destroy them, you take them off the board. Tanks, they become wrecks, and now they're an obstruction on the field. Infantry can hide behind them for +1 defense, that kind of stuff. So it's now an obstacle here on the field, so it's a wreck. And casualties. When you shoot a tank, you have the possibility of 2 casualty points. 1 point for the tank and a possible 2nd point for the crew. So the defender is going to roll a die 6, and if he rolls a 6, the crew will actually have bailed out of the vehicle and be safe. I rolled a 5, so the crew did not safely bail from the vehicle. So that's 2 casualty points for the loss of that tank. So things are looking really good for the Germans right now. So that impulse would be done, and then the impulse is going to come back to the Germans one more time, or I mean to the Russians, and they're going to decide what to do. Let's see here. Probably the best thing to do, we're going to take this Russian group and we're going to fire up at this German unit here, just for grins. So we've done this before. We add up our firepower. So he's got a firepower of 3 for the rifle, and then he's got 2 for the machine gun, that's 5, and 1 for the attached leader, so that's 6. Then we look at the defense of this rifle, which is 4, 1 for the hedge, and that gives them a 5. So 6 firepower minus 5 defense gives me +1 modifier on the infantry table. So the infantry table, I'm going to roll my 2 die 6, because remember, you don't have to hit, you're just seeing how effective all those bullets are that land in the hex. So I roll an 11, I come across to the +1, and they scored a destroyed. Wow. So we'll just go ahead and remove them and their counter. That scores 2 victory, or 2 casualty points for the German player, 2. And then the rifle gets a first fire. We'll just rearrange the icons there, and there you go. And he spent his last impulse point. So that would be an example of the first, a turn. At the end of a turn, you then remove all of the first fire, second fire. There's actually a lot of things that come down in the game as far as statuses, but a lot of those would be removed at the end of the turn. You can have a unit spin you could have a unit spin an impulse point to dig in and put an improved defensive marker in their hex to try and dig themselves into the ground. I have here the different markers. There's first move, the second move, second fire marker. Vehicles, tanks can get bogged. They can get broken. That's one of the morale effects that they would have to face. They could become exhausted if they do both their first and second fire and then take that final third action we talked about when they were spent. Tanks can become immobilized. That's a damage result. You can damage the machine guns on a tank. So if we're looking here at the player A card, if you hit a tank, it's a possibility that you could get a D result, which is damage. You just roll a die 6, and then a 2, that would tell you it was minor damage, nothing happened. Or you could destroy the machine guns or the main gun or immobilize it, and then that's when you would just apply the appropriate marker. Or shaken. So there's actually a lot of things that you can do to the units in the game. This is what I really like about it. There's some detail here, but it's real easy to apply. The rules are very straightforward in how to apply the different status effects, how to rally. Rally is simple. We didn't have anybody that needed to rally, but rally is in the rule book. If you want to take a look at how you rally, let's see, come down. Rally would be here under unit morale, section 21, and it tells you that you spend an impulse. And what's cool about this, and why I like it, is if you fail your rally roll, you use an impulse, but when it comes back to your turn, your side of that impulse, you can spend another impulse to attempt a rally. So if you don't rally that one unit, you can spend several times in a row going back and forth trying to rally that one unit if you want, if it's that important to you. So I like it because you can do it, but it costs you something. It's not free. Well, I take it back. There's the free rally. You get to try it once. So when it comes back to you at the beginning of each turn, not each impulse, but at the beginning of each turn, it says both sides make a free rally attempt on each unit. So throughout the turn, as you accumulate shaken and broken statuses, you have to spend impulse. But then at the beginning of a turn, you get one free rally attempt. Then after that, you go back to spending your impulses. So you have to decide, do I move and fight with my troops, or do I try and rally them to get some of them from that broken or shaken status? Fire groups, we talked about that. Movement, we didn't really talk about movement, but movement's very simple. Like most games, you have a movement number. Single man counters, they usually attach themselves to a squad, so they move with the squad. So the squad here, for example, let's just pull them out, has a movement of 4. So each hex is 1 movement point, and then each of the terrain features you move into would have an associated cost. You just have to look at the player aid chart, and it tells you if you're moving into woods, for example, with infantry, that costs 2 movement points. So if I was like right here, that'd be 1, 2. I'd still have 2 movement points left over. So pretty simple. 1 to move into clear. You can do an assault move. We talked about firing. They have assault, so you can move into close combat. So that would lock these 2 units into close combat until that was resolved. So that's movement. Real easy. There's some other things I like too. When you are shooting, if I had, let's say, let's put 2 rifles here. Infantry. First of all, stacking, you can put 2 units in a hex, and then their associated equipment, if they had like machine guns and Molotovs attached to them, and a leader. So you can only really have a leader and 2 units at any one time in a hex. So I could have 1 infantry and a tank and a leader, but you're never going to have like 3 or 4 squads in a hex. So what I like is if I had 2 here and this group shot into this hex, they don't attack everything in the hex. They attack 1 unit within the hex. And that represents that these units are not sitting on top of each other, but they're in defensive positions within that hex, hunkering down, and then these guys are attacking that section of the hex. So they think that there's troops there. That's what they're attacking. So they're not attacking the entire hex. They're attacking a specific section of the hex. So that's kind of cool. As far as the single man counters, only a sniper can pick through the stack and say, I want to attack the the lieutenant, essentially. So the single man counters are pretty well protected. If you have him out in the open, then he's targetable, but if you can embed him with other folks, he's pretty well protected. So that was one of the mechanics that I liked there. You had to pick exactly what you want to attack. When I was up here, when this rifle squad is attached, because because they're at the bottom of the, well, they're part of the stack, but they're at the bottom. He's in here somewhere. There's a rifle squad hidden. But when they're taking fire from the Russians down at the bottom, the Russian player is assumed to attack the rifle because he can't individually attack the machine gun or the sergeant. So I mean, there's a lot of depth here. Check through the rules, but I hope this gives you an idea of how some of this plays out. I think that in time, as folks get to play it, and as I get more comfortable and I get to play it with the actual components, it's going to be a great game because it combines armor rules and the infantry rules. They play very similar, but they do have their own feel. I also like how it feels like World War II has been explained to me through the History Channel. Tiger tanks are tough. Tiger tanks kill in one shot a lot of times. You have to overwhelm a Tiger tank with a lot of enemy T-34s to either hit the sides or get lucky shots. It kind of has that feel. Excuse me. The Tiger tank with that huge cannon just feels like it dominates. And what will be nice is as the expansions come out to really see how all this equipment compares. So when the Russians get like their IS-1s and 2s versus like a Tiger II and the Panthers, so you can kind of see how those play out in the game. So there's a lot of room here for growth. The impulse point, so it's not a traditional I go you go, but yet still has kind of that staggered initiative and allows folks to be in the game instead of waiting for your opponent to go through several I don't know how else to explain it, but basically just sit there while your opponent does all of his actions for 10-20 minutes and then you do yours for 10 or 20 minutes. This goes back and forth, which keeps everybody involved in the game. It allows you to change your tactics on the fly, because as you lose a vehicle, then not only does your opponent react to your loss, but now you have to think about, well, now how do I change what I'm going to do based on that loss? So you're always changing your strategies as you play through. It's great. And there's a lot of other aspects we haven't talked on. Artillery, airstrikes. Other than the defense, there's like bunkers and barbed wire, mines, engineer actions. I mean, there's a lot to it, but it's all easy to grasp because it runs on a really great engine. So I would say if you're going to look at this as a gateway game, you probably could. I would say Memoir 44 is the pinnacle gateway game to the idea of wargaming, board game / war game. But then you move up to, say, Conflict of Heroes, which has real similar levels of detail with their AP points and the back and forth play. But I think this adds just a little bit more with at least the armor rules for having your range, the variable armor penetration depending on range. It just adds just a little bit more detail in that regard. So I would say this is a pretty good game. Not as deep as Squad Leader, or Advanced Squad Leader, I should say. Not as advanced as Panzer II 2nd Edition. But if you look at Panzer 2nd Edition, they also have a basic set of rules that use just a front and a rear armor, and then they use very simplistic armor charts for comparing the damage over range as well. So this takes a lot of good ideas from a lot of games and just kind of sticks it into one. So I thoroughly enjoy it. So hopefully this has explained the game a little bit better for you. And if you haven't decided on a pledge level, check them out, because there's some PDF copies that you could get. So instead of buying the whole game, just get a PDF print version that you can print out and play, or just pay for, they have like a basic set which gives you like one map and some counters and some scenarios to try it out. So just see what level interests you the most, and the reason why I'm hoping we can push this through. Let's see here. Yeah, this here, the Def Leppard pledge. Okay, so this is the third stretch. It's the heavy metal. So they just had this great, it's a joke, Def Leppard heavy metal. But at 44,000, they're going to add 8 new counters, 2 new scenarios that take advantage of Tiger tanks. Don't know what the other vehicles would be, but it says here enjoying the big monsters. So possibly you might have Panthers, maybe you might get some Russian IS-1, IS-2, so you can just do some big battles. But that's the next stretch goal. So 44,000, and then you have, right now we're currently at 33, so we need like 11,000 to hit that last stretch. So hopefully, you know, we can reach it. We got 6 days, 5 days about the time after this post. So thank you for watching. If you have questions about the game rules that, you know, could be explained that maybe we didn't cover in detail here, because this was supposed to be a short example, ask your questions. I'm sure somebody will clarify. If I can't, somebody smarter than I can clarify. But let's just keep the discussion going and see if we can hit that 4th stretch goal. All right, thanks a lot, everybody. Bye.